Chapter 26. Rue gathered up his board and tiles. Oni climbed up the boy and stood on his shoulder. They both took a big breath and left the room. The warehouse was dark except for a lone lantern hanging over the table in the middle of the room. It reminded Rue of the first time he peeked through a tavern window in the Cursed Town, where he saw two dolls battling. Was that only a day ago? He felt exhausted. He had only managed a few hours' sleep and carried tight bruises across his whole body. He could barely see out of his right eye. He knew there was a crowd in the shadows, but he could only make out vague shapes as he approached the lit table. Vince sat on the opposite side. She smiled slightly as Rue limped towards her. Copperhead was already swaying in the centre of the table. Rue sat down, placing his board in front of him. Oni leapt off his shoulder and landed lightly onto the table. He stood calmly in front of the spiked doll, his great eye holding Copperhead in a level stare. Rue emptied his tiles from his pouch into his hand. Vint was watching him closely. "Those aren't the tiles we gave you, Rue," she whispered softly. Rue nodded. "You are going to have to beat me fair and square, Vint. We both know that's what you want anyway." The gang leader said nothing. She stared at Rue, her eyes calculating, her face unreadable. Eventually she gave a nod. "Thank you," she said simply. Rue glanced up, surprised at the response. He had expected some sort of threat for breaking the agreement. Instead he saw just how important a clear victory was for Vint. There was no one close enough to hear them speak. "Vint, what's happened to you?" Rue whispered across the table. "You've always been many things. You've been a thief, a bully, a thug, maybe even a killer, but only to survive. What you plan is a cold-blooded massacre." Vint frowned at the boy and then grimaced. "Ah, eavesdropping." She tipped her tiles onto her hand. "You don't know me at all, Rue. Pirate Bowl has his plans, and I have my own." The conversation was cut short as the announcer approached the table. The man nodded to them both and then turned to address the crowd. "The next match is a promotional green match between two up-and-coming locals. To my left is Ventura, the Viper, Tuno, winner of 5 straight, currently undefeated, prodigy of Master Bowl and respected member of the Yor community. Her champion is the fearsome Copperhead, terror of the tables." Rue and Oni both watched as a spiked doll raised its nailed fists as the crowd cheered. It crashed its claws together, creating a shower of sparks. It then threw its head around like an angry bull, its deadly mohawk of sharpened nails cutting through the air. The crowd roared. The announcer read from a small card in his hand, his eyes squinting. "And this is Rube the Udai and his doll, Ono." The small doll turned his huge eye to the crowd and waved happily. Rue shrunk lower into his seat. There was a small clap from the shadows. Someone coughed. "All bets are now closed," said the announcer as he backed away from the table. "Let the match begin." Rue did not know what to do. He watched Vint from the corner of his eye. The gang leader threw her tiles across the board. It flared up powerfully, the blues glowing brightest. Vint then studied her layout. Rue copied her, throwing his own tiles over his board. His colours burst into life, lighting the room. The intensity of the light surprised him, now that he knew what to look for. The reds and blues flared the strongest, casting a purple hue over the table. The crowd murmured in appreciation. Rue glanced up at Vint and was pleased to see her squinting in the light. Vint met his gaze and shrugged. "Your doll is weak. Give it as much power as you like." Oni stared hard at Vint, then settled into a fighting stance. Copperhead bared his claws. Vint turned her attention back to the board, then clapped her hands and held them over the tiles, hovering in anticipation. Rue watched her curiously. "What are you doing?" "Waiting on you," said the girl. "To do what?" "Clap your hands when you are ready." "You mean ready to play?" "Yes." "Ah." Rue looked at his board, then to the two dolls, then back to Vint, who stayed poised over her tiles, her focus on the board. Vint, said Rue. There was silence. Vint. What? How do I know when I'm ready to play? Vint glanced up angrily. When you are happy with your tile layout. Ah, said Rue, looking down at his board. He saw a few moves there, but not a complete unlock. He peered over at Vint's tiles. He couldn't see a full unlock there either. And you're happy with yours? Yes, said Vint. Really? It's fine. What if I'm not happy with mine? Asked Rue. What do I do? Nothing, hissed Vint. You still have to play it. Oni stepped out of his stance and wandered over to Rue's board. He leaned against it and looked at the tiles. See, Oni, it's not great, is it? The doll agreed. Vint rolled her head back in exasperation. The announcer wandered over. What is the problem? He whispered. I'm not happy with my tiles. Can we start again? Asked Rue. The announcer looked at him uncertainly. Have you played this before, lad? Rue shook his head. Oni nodded. The announcer sighed. You can't start again. The clap is just a way to say both players are ready. Some delay the clap to plan a few moves in advance. Oh, said Rue, looking over at Vint, still poised, hands shaking slightly. You should have told me that. Vint clenched her teeth in a snarl. Vint. The girl slammed her fists on the table, half standing out of her chair. Just clap your damn hands, she roared. Rue clapped and began sliding tiles. Oni gathered up a swirling red and blue orb and leapt across the table. He landed a flying kick into Copperhead's chest, sending the doll crashing into Vint's board. The gang leader sat down quickly. She was flustered and stabbed at her tiles. Oni had landed another kick before colours started filling the spiked doll. Copperhead recovered quickly, shaking off the hits. Soon he was on the attack, his claws a silver blur as he pressed forward. Oni moved like a dancer, swaying and swirling as colours filled him. Rue had little time to look up. His world was the tiles in front of him. He felt fear creeping in, but this time it was different. It wasn't fear of Vint or of taking another beating. It was fear for his little doll fighting in front of him, fighting with all it had. It was the fear of letting him down. Rue concentrated. He found a rhythm, sliding tiles quickly as patterns formed. Colours burst from his board, flying out to the edges of his vision. He was vaguely aware of the two dolls fighting in front of him. Oni on the back foot, barely avoiding the razor-sharp claws from the savage snake doll. He heard Vint chuckling. You're not attacking, building up the red like Hawkins did, said the girl, her fingers a blur, a steady stream of colour filling her doll. That's your plan? You think one powerful attack will hurt me? With those soft hands. Rue tried to ignore her. He swiftly unlocked a full layout of tiles, just in time as Copperhead's claws raked across Oni. As quickly as the attack cut Oni open, he healed, the sackcloth threads rebinding and closing. You can't run forever, Rue. And you can't hurt me either. Another claw struck. The snake was getting faster and stronger. Oni was slowing. His defense started to look ragged. His sackcloth body was ripped open again. This time, it was slow to heal. Rue hesitated on moving a tile as doubt crept in. Oni was raked across his eye. He was taking a beating. It was all going wrong. Rue felt the familiar urge to run, or to curl up into a ball and just let Vint beat him again. He felt his body scream at him to run. He stood, but his feet wouldn't move. His doll battled valiantly in front of him, not giving an inch as the fearsome Copperhead slashed wildly with its claws. He couldn't abandon Oni. He had promised to stand with him. Rue found himself roaring against his fear. He wasn't sure if he was screaming out loud or just inside his head. He didn't care. Rue planted his feet firmly. He stood his ground, and he leaned into the task of moving the tiles, his fingers flicking faster and faster. Oni began healing as the greens streamed into him. Sparks flew off Copperhead's claws as the blue orbs hardened Oni's sackcloth skin. The small doll still absorbed and stored the red, not using it to power any attacks. Vint growled in frustration. You play well enough. Maybe with a better doll you might even be a challenge. More chunks of cloth and thread flew off Oni as Copperhead pressed his attacks, his claws glowing red. But as I keep telling you, this one is a poor design. No armour, no weapons. Vint looked across to Rue as Copperhead backed up Oni against a WHISP board. No chance, she said with a sneer. Rue met Vince's gaze. Fear had left him. He felt calm. Oni, now. Vince frowned. Oni stepped forward and embraced the snake doll. The claws raked at his side. He twisted and lifted Copperhead over his back and onto his shoulder. Then he leapt. It was a mighty leap, powered by all the red Oni had been saving. Both of them watched as the dolls rose high above the table. Vint looked mildly confused. Rue's eyes were wide. At the height of the leap, Oni pulled Copperhead off his shoulder and held him upside down. He turned and regarded Vint with a button stare. Then they plummeted back down to the table. Copperhead hit it hard, head first, with all of Oni's weight behind him. His spiked mohawk impaled the wooden tabletop, driving down deep. Oni rolled aside and came to his feet. Copperhead stayed upside down, balanced on his skewered mohawk. His tail of wooden balls thrashed wildly and his claws flailed, but he was stuck fast. There was a stunned silence in the room. The only sound was Copperhead's claws scratching feebly at the table as his tail whipped through the air. Oni turned to Rue, a smile in his eye. Rue smiled back. He looked up at Vint. A poor design, it seems. Vint sat back, perturbed. She considered her board, the colours still glowing. I haven't actually lost, she said finally. Rue nodded. I suppose Oni could slowly pull him apart. Maybe start with the tail? Vint slowly looked up at Rue, her eyes hooded. Rue shrugged. I'm not sure how long it would take. Oni seemed to roll up his sleeves. He approached Copperhead with purpose. A figure loomed over the two players. It was Earthmender Elsa. I have seen enough, she said with a small smile. Oni turned to her and waved. Crowfoot hopped excitedly on the old woman's head. Hello, little one, she said, bowing slightly to Oni. I thought I had lost you forever. The small doll bowed back deeply. You know Oni? Sputtered Rue. Oni, is it? A fitting name indeed. Yes, I know him. She smiled at Rue's shocked expression. A tale for another time, I think. The Earthmender glanced up at the bird doll on her head. Crowfoot, meet Oni. She gave Crowfoot a small nod and the bird doll soared down to the table. Oni bowed deeply and Crowfoot returned it, dipping her jewelled head. Copperhead sagged sadly beside them, giving up his struggles. Oni pointed to the sky excitedly and Crowfoot nodded. The one-eyed doll gave a happy leap and then climbed onto the bird doll's back. They took to the air, Oni holding on tight. The two players and the Earthmender watched them as they circled higher and higher. Rue smiled as the two totems swooped across the warehouse. They flew over the head of Pirate Bowl and a dozen rough-looking men at his side. The Pirate Lord was glaring at Rue, murder in his eyes. He whispered something to his men and they nodded grimly. Rue's smile faded quickly as the men fanned out. The boy glanced around quickly, planning his escape. He made to rise, but Earthmender Elsa rested her hand softly on his shoulder and then stepped forward to meet Pirate Bowl. The huge man loomed over the tiny old woman. Rue felt slightly foolish hiding behind her. I need a word with both of them, Bowl said gruffly. Earthmender Elsa looked at Pirate Bowl and his men. She looked down at the weapons in their hands. I don't think that's a conversation they would enjoy, she said softly. Nevertheless, they are in my charge, he said, glaring at Rue. We have much to discuss. Rue found his voice. I am not in your charge. I haven't been for years. The old woman inclined her head. There you have it then, a free man, free to make his own decisions. She turned to Rue. Would you like to be a student at my school, young man? Rue tore his eyes off the pirates. What? I'm inviting you to Eru, to study magic. Why? Oh, people study magic for many reasons. No, I mean, why me? He whispered sharply. Pirate Bowl shifted his weight impatiently. Elsa smiled. Oni chose you. That button eye of his sees everything. All eyes turned to the boy. Pirate Bowl stared with barely suppressed anger. His men tensed behind him. Vince's face was unreadable. Earthmender Elsa smiled as a question hung in the air. Rue looked back and forth between the Pirate Lord and the Earthmender. His mind raced as he weighed his options. On one hand, stay in Yor and get killed by Pirate Bowl, probably within the next hour. Or leave with the old woman and study magic. That's if they were allowed to leave at all. Still, a small chance was better than none. He nodded dumbly. "Excellent," the old woman clapped. "Then the boy comes with me. I'm afraid your conversation will have to wait. Now, if you excuse me, I believe I'm about to be ambushed." Pirate Bowl stared at Rue in anger for a moment before the old woman's words sunk in. He glanced sharply at her, raising an eyebrow. She looked up to the rafters. The end of chapter 26. Thank you very much for listening, and if you like that, leave me a like. Chapter 27 is coming soon. Thank you. Bye.